The engines of Air Force One droned like a steady heartbeat, a low metal lullaby beneath the carpeted floors and leather seats. Outside the oval windows, the sky was white on white sunlight, shearing off a cloud deck that looked smooth enough to walk across. Inside, a different weather system brewed, the kind that forms when promises meet protocol. When two men with different duties share the same narrow aisle. It was 1985. Reagan was returning from California, a speech behind him, a stack of policy memos before him, and a letter, just a single page, that he had folded so many times the edges had grown as soft as cloth. He had read it once on the motorcade, again at the stairway before boarding, once more in the forward cabin where the steward set down his coffee, and then again and again, as if the ink might change with each pass, might offer up some new route for a man who had learned that governing was mostly navigation with broken instruments. "Mr. President?" Jim, his chief of staff, stood in the doorway. Jim Baker always looked like time itself, measured, precise, expensive. "We're on schedule. Touchdown Andrews 1900. Reagan slid the letter across the table with 2 fingers. "Schedules. Not the problem, Jim. We're flying over it." Baker glanced down. He knew that handwriting before he read the name. The shakes, the pressure marks where the pen had pressed too hard. The language of pain before the vowels. Sergeant Ethan Ward, Baker read. Marine, 24. "He's in the hospital at Topeka," Reagan said. "Lost a leg, maybe more than that. But what he's most afraid of is what he won't be able to do for his fiancée. I promised her I'd walk down the aisle," he wrote. "Now I can't even stand without a harness." Baker folded the page back toward Reagan, as if returning a weapon. "Sir, we have a tight posture on this flight. Weather is turning ugly over Kansas. Secret Service will not." "James," Reagan said gently, and there was a soft humor in it that had nothing to do with jokes. "Do you know what a promise costs if you don't pay it? It gets interest." Baker hesitated. The pilot would never agree. The FAA wouldn't like it. The press would. Well, the press would make whatever they wanted out of it. But there were also days, Baker knew this, when the map had to be redrawn in ink you couldn't buy in Washington. "I'll bring Colonel Collins," Baker said. Colonel David Collins carried the air around him like the last vestige of a runway, cool, flat, charted. He was the kind of man who ironed his flight plans in his head. Tall, steel gray at the temples, a pair of pilot's wings that had moved through more storms than most men had seen. From their living room windows, he saluted at the threshold. Reagan rose a small courtesy that altered the gravity of the room. "Colonel," Reagan said, holding out a hand. Collins took it. The president's palm was warm, his grip certain, like a man who knew 2 things for sure, what he believed and where the exits were. "Sir," Collins said, "how can I be of service?" Reagan gestured to the seat. "We need a slight detour. Not a photo op, not a speech. If anyone asks, we're chasing a tailwind." The colonel waited. Pilots learned early the importance of silence, how to hold it like a cup and let men pour their reasons inside. "There's a veteran at Topeka, VA, Reagan said. "A Marine. Wrote me a letter he never expected me to read. I'd like to stop." Collins didn't change expression, but he tilted his head the way a man does when he's listening to a frequency only he can hear. Weather, fuel, security, alternate, crew duty limits. The invisible math of risk began lining up like ghosts behind his eyes. "Sir, we planned a corridor east of the Rockies to avoid an unstable system. There's convection building over eastern Kansas. Nothing we can't manage, but enough to make our people sweat. And the security footprint at that hospital. We'd be improvising." "I've made a career out of improvising," Reagan said. He smiled. The lines around his eyes didn't vanish, but rearranged into something braver. Collins let out a breath. "With respect, Mr. President, I'm responsible for your safety. And I'm responsible for the promises we make to the people who defend that safety," Reagan said. He tapped the letter with 1 finger. He asked if I still believed we don't leave our wounded behind. I'd hate to answer him by flying right over his head. The colonel looked at the windows, at the brilliant sky, at the paper that might as well have been a distress flare. He had turned down generals. He had told senators that cloud ceilings did not bow to committee. But the man in front of him had been elected by the same people he was asking to detour for. Service recognized service. I won't take you into thunderstorms, Collins said finally. We'll skirt the worst of it. We'll need Topeka Regional to clear a lane. We'll need Secret Service to accept the rolling containment with minimal exterior footprint. Baker spoke from the doorway. They'll say no. Then tell them we're already there, Collins said. He stood. Sir, if we do this, we do it clean. No press, wheels down, short visit, wheels up. You give me 22 minutes on the ground, I'll give you a safe climb out ahead of the line of cells. Reagan extended his hand again. Colonel, you get me to that young man, and I'll owe you one I can't pay back. Collins clasped it. Mr. President, you'll pay it by letting me say no next time if I have to. Reagan's mouth bent into that half-smile the nation knew. Deal. The aircraft banked left with the lazy grace of a ship turning toward a lighthouse. In the upper galley, a steward steadied a tray with 2 fingers. In the communications office, a sergeant frowned at a storm display green building to yellow. Yellow whispering orange dot in the cabin. Reagan wrote something on the margin of the letter. He didn't show it to anyone. He folded the paper again. The creases like scars now. Nancy called from the residence line, patched through the secure phone. She could always hear the sky in his voice when he was airborne, some lift in his tone. Like he had taken a little altitude inside. You're doing it again, aren't you? She said. Doing what? Driving your staff crazy for the right reasons. He laughed softly. A detour. Small one. Is there any other kind? She said. Then quieter. Be safe. I have an angel on my shoulder, he said. Have 2, she replied. When they hung up, Reagan touched the cross under his shirt. Old habit. Old map. Colonel Collins slid into the left seat. The co-pilot Captain Alvarez already bringing up the weather overlay. Lightning strikes pulsed like distant camera flashes on a red carpet sky. Mr. President, Collins said over the interphone, we'll take a wider arc northwest, slice down between cells, ride a lower altitude to stay beneath the rougher tops. It'll be a little bumpy. Colonel, Reagan said, I've ridden worse in a convertible. Copy that, Collins replied, and smiled despite himself. They dropped from 31,000 to 21, the clouds drawing closer, the horizon a smudge. The seatbelt lights chimed. Air Force One was a palace when the air was smooth. It became a long humming question mark when it wasn't out in the communications bay. A duty officer worked a quiet miracle. Topeka Regional coordinated with the Air National Guard. A strip would be cleared. Perimeter tightened with Kansas Highway. Patrol cruisers that could be mistaken for any other cars if you didn't notice the way their drivers watched the world. Secret. Service argued and then converted argument to choreography. Men trained for chaos learned long ago that the fastest way to control a storm was to name every drop of rain. 22 minutes, the detail leader said into his mic. In, greet, to the ward out. Sir, Baker said, stepping back. Into the cabin. They're complying. Is that what we call it now? Reagan asked. We call it not resigning, Baker said. But his eyes warmed. The first bump was like a shrug from God. The second made the glasses rattle. The third lifted the president's stomach an inch before handing it back. Reagan turned. His wedding band with his thumb. He could feel the old injury along his ribs announce itself like a memory. The horse fall. The stunt gone wrong. The years accumulated in a body that had walked so many stages it had learned how to find the light. In any room. He closed his eyes for a second and saw a boy on the Rock River counting heads as they came up. making 77 marks in his mind and swearing each one meant a life he would not let go under. "Colonel," Reagan said into the handset clipped. At his elbow, "How's our tail?" "Doing your kind of work, sir," Collins replied. "It's behind us, and it's mean. But we've got a door in front of us if we keep moving." Reagan nodded to no one and to everyone. Topeka smelled like wet concrete and cut grass. The wind shoved at the motorcade as if it resented being left out of the meeting. The sky to the west was a bruised, blooming slow. They rolled straight from the runway to a security door where a nurse in a pale green jacket stood with both hands twisted in her pockets. She was the first person who didn't seem surprised to see a president. Maybe because she had seen so many wars end on hospital sheets. "Mr. President," she said, "I'm Rita." "Rita," Reagan said, taking her hand with that same warm certainty. "Thank you for taking care of our boys." "Sometimes they take care of us," she said. "He's been waiting just in case you came. He thought I might?" "No," she said. "He thought you might not, but he wrote anyway." Reagan looked at the floor tile as they walked, a pattern that repeated every 10 steps, a comfort to men relearning motion. The wards smelled like antiseptic and something sweeter, the smell of hope when it's still stapled to pain. Ethan Ward was all shoulders and freckles and the kind of eyes that look older on some faces than others. The bed was tilted so he could look out at the parking lot, where the Kansas flags were arguing with the wind. His left pant leg was folded flat and pinned. The sheet was tight, army corners, pride doing what muscle couldn't. "Mr. Ward," Reagan said. "Sir," Ethan said, trying to sit taller. He managed an inch. Reagan pulled a chair close enough that their knees could have touched if there had been two. For a moment he said nothing. He put his elbows on his thighs, the way men do when they watch a sunrise and don't want to scare it away. "You wrote me a letter," Reagan said. Double quotes, "Yes, sir. I didn't think it would get past anybody. He stopped. Men like Ethan were not built to cry in front of presidents. They were built to hold back floods with their teeth. But a single tear made a break for it anyway, and he turned his head like he could outflank it. Reagan let him have the silence. Then he reached into his jacket and unfolded the battered paper. The creased edges looked like a map to a place you only find when you've lost something else. "You said you promised your fiancée you'd walk down the aisle," Reagan said. "And now you don't know how to keep that promise." Ethan swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Do you know how many promises change shape and still hold?" Reagan asked. "My mother used to say God doesn't close a door without opening a window. I figure sometimes he opens a ramp." Ethan smiled without meaning to. "A ramp?" "You and I," Reagan said. "We're both in the business of keeping promises in ways they weren't first imagined." Ethan looked at the folded pant leg, then at Reagan's face. "Sir, I'm supposed to be strong. I feel like I'm less than I was." Reagan leaned forward until Ethan could see the small nicks in his shave, the old man texture that television blurred and humans recognized. "Son, I've played a lot of roles. The only time I felt less was when I pretended I felt more. You hear me?" Ethan nodded. The room was small, but something big fit inside it, dignity in civilian clothes. The door clicked. A woman with wind-tangled hair entered the ward carrying a bouquet that had lost a few petals to the parking lot. She saw the president and forgot how hands work, how knees work, how breath works. "Sir," she whispered. "You must be Claire," Reagan said, rising. "I read about you. Smart, stubborn, good shot with a look." She laughed despite the wet in her eyes. "Yes, sir." She put the flowers on the table and took Ethan's hand. The way her fingers wrapped around his made Reagan think of rope thrown true on water. "May I be impertinent?" Reagan asked. They nodded. He turned to the door. "Rita?" The nurse entered, amused like a person who knows she's about to say yes to something unorthodox. "Do you have a hallway?" Reagan asked. "That's wide enough for a first walk," Rita smiled. We have a corridor we call the river. It goes past windows and ends at a mural of a wheat field. Reagan looked at Ethan. I can't give you your old walk, but I can help you start your new one. Ethan swallowed again. Sir, I don't have. Rita was already at the closet, already bringing the sleek carbon fiber prosthetic the therapists called the Sparrow. The tech arrived with a harness and the calm voice of a man who knew the value of slow. It took 10 minutes to stand, 10 minutes that lasted a lifetime. Claire's hand on Ethan's shoulder, the therapist's hand at his waist. Reagan's hand on the bed rail, knuckles white with the strain of not hovering. When Ethan rose, the room changed shape to accommodate him. He was taller than his fear. The therapist counted softly. 1, 2, shift, good, 2 more, breathe. They entered the river. The windows gleamed with fresh rain. In the middle distance, lightning stitched the horizon as if sewing 2 pieces of sky together. Ethan took a step. It sounded like paper tearing and also like a national anthem. Another step. The Sparrow flexed and learned him the way a good horse learns a rider. At the mural, he rested, breath hitching and then catching smooth. Claire leaned, her head on his shoulder, and looked at the painted wheat. The way it bent and did not break. Mr. President, Ethan said, I could do that. You just did, Reagan replied. 20-2 minutes became 35. Secret Service surrendered to the kind of timetable only mercy understands. Colonel Collins stayed strapped in upstairs, doing the weather math again and again, carving safe corridors out of bad ideas. Baker stood off to one side with Rita and watched the walk end in laughter that sounded like broken glass being swept from a kitchen floor. He does this, Baker said, and he wasn't talking to her, but she answered anyway. So do we, she said. One hallway at a time. Reagan signed a program for an orderly who swore he'd never liked politics, but liked people who remembered to ask names. He shook hands with a physical therapist who told him he had the posture of a dancer. He thanked the janitor for the shine on the floors that made the place look like morning, even in the late afternoon. At the door, Reagan turned back to Ethan. Son, he said, the only thing you owe anyone is the courage to accept help and then pass it forward when it's your turn. Ethan straightened again, the letter now folded in his own hands. Sir, permission to write you another letter someday. You'll do more than write, Reagan said. You'll walk it. Back. On the tarmac, the wind had changed its mind. It was coming from the south now, warm, carrying the smell of wet wheat and cut diesel. Collins watched the squall line creep east. The way a black dog creeps along a fence, it knows it can't jump. Let's go, he told Alvarez. South then east. Thread the needle. Keep it smooth enough for a man to make a call to his wife. Air. Force 1 rolled, rotated, climbed. The city fell away into rectangles and lines, the hospital becoming a matchbox, the corridor a thread of light. Colonel, Reagan said into the interphone, remind me to never play cards with you. Your risk face is too good. Collins chuckled. Yes, sir. You gave me clear intent. I gave you safe execution. That's the deal. Reagan considered that. Wish we could put it in the platform. You already did, Collins said. You called it trust. The ride settled into a hum again, the ceiling up to 28,000. The cells behind them bruising the western edge of the world, but not chasing. The steward brought coffee, and then, with a conspirator's tilt of the head, a slice of warm pie that no one had ordered and everyone appreciated. Baker slid into the opposite seat. Sir, the press asks where we were. I told them you were visiting the heartland. I was, Reagan said. Do we say more? Reagan looked at the letter, at the new note he had written in the margin earlier, the one he had kept to himself. No, he said. We let the story belong to the people it's about. If we did right, we won't need credit. Baker nodded. There's one more thing, Mr. President. Colonel Collins asked me to relay a message. He says the next time weather says no, He reserves the right to agree with it. Reagan grinned. Tell him I expect him to. Night threw velvet across the windows. The cabin lights dimmed to gold. Somewhere aft, a radio operator laughed at something only another operator would find funny. Up front, Collins watched the stars peep through the scrim of cloud, navigators older than math. Reagan dialed the residence again. Well? Nancy said. It rained, he said. It usually does when you plant something. She answered. He told her about the river corridor, about Rita, about Claire's hand on Ethan's shoulder, about the sparrow. He told her about the wheat mural. And the first step, and how it sounded like a flag deciding which way to fly. You're quiet, she said when he finished. Just paying interest on a promise, he said. Come home, she replied. We'll balance the books. 2 weeks later, a small package arrived at the White House sealed in brown tape and hope. Inside was a Polaroid, colors a little wrong, angles a little too honest. Ethan in a church corridor, in a tux that fit at the shoulders and fought at the hem. Claire on his arm, her dress gathering light like a net. At the bottom of the photo, in Sharpie, we found a ramp. There was also a letter. Reagan read it alone in the Oval Office after the last handshake of the day, after the Marine at the door had been relieved, after the city outside had become an electrical constellation. Mr. President, the therapist says I'll always think about my old step when I take the new one. He says that's okay. I like to believe every man walks with the ghosts of his past and the angels of his promises. Thank you for letting me borrow yours for an afternoon. When we left the hospital, Claire asked me if I felt like Les. I told her no. I just felt different. She said, different is what people say right before stronger. I promised you another letter. I'll write you a third the day I carry our daughter down that river corridor and show her the mural. I'll tell her a president taught her dad that sometimes the bravest course is the one that bends. Semper Fi. Ethan Reagan set the letter down and stared at the resolute desk, at the scuffs left by men who had come before him, at his own scratches added to the history of wood. He thought about Colonel Collins in the left seat, about the way the man had defined service with a single compromise that was not really a compromise at all. He thought about Rita and the way nurses held entire worlds together with warm hands and clipped voices. He thought about a boy on the Rock River, counting to 77, and learning for the first time that leadership sometimes meant standing at the edge and refusing to let people slip past you into the dark. He picked up a pen and wrote a note to himself, the kind that never went to archives because it was not about law or policy. It was about course corrections. When the map doesn't show a way to keep your promise, draw one. Then fly it clean. He tucked the note into the top drawer and closed it like a secret. On a crisp morning in late autumn, Colonel Collins walked into the hangar where Air Force One rested between missions. He ran a hand along the fuselage, as if feeling for a heartbeat. The crew chief waved him over. On the bulletin board beside the maintenance logs, someone had pinned a newspaper clipping. No headline, just a photo of a young man in a suit standing at the front of a church with a woman on his arm, both of them smiling like two people who had learned the future could be edited. Without losing meaning, Collins didn't ask who had put it there. He already knew. He looked up at the wings. We did our job, he said to no one, and to everyone whose fingerprints had ever been on a rivet. Years later, when people told stories about Reagan, some told the big ones, the speeches, the summits, the walls that fell. Others told the small ones, which were usually the big ones in disguise. A steward would say the president always thanked him by name, even when the aircraft bounced. A communications tech would say the president knew the coffee tasted different over Nebraska and smiled like that was a state secret. A nurse in Kansas would say a man came through a storm to walk a hallway with a kid who thought walking was a verb he no longer owned. And Colonel Collins, retired now, would sometimes, on quiet afternoons, pull a folded letter from a desk drawer. It was from a Marine whose handwriting had grown steady with time. It had a photo tucked inside. A little girl at the end of a long hospital corridor pointing at a mural of wheat. Her father kneeling beside her, showing her where wind came from. On the back of the photo, in a new hand rounder, uncertain, trying. To learn the world, someone had scrawled in crayon. We found the ramp. Collins would smile, put the letter back, and step out onto his porch. He would look up. Some men navigate by instruments. Some navigate by stars. He had learned once, on a stormy afternoon over Kansas, that sometimes you navigate by a promise and you land precisely where you are needed most. Ethan kept his third promise. He wrote again when his daughter was born. He wrote when she took her first steps. He wrote the day he walked her into first grade and realized the hallway was shorter than he remembered because he had grown. President wrote back when he could, and when he couldn't, Nancy did, with a pen that turned strangers into family. In a cardboard box that followed the wards from apartment to house to bigger house, and then to a home with a ramp built as beautifully as any staircase, there was a folder labeled Detour, and inside it, a letter with soft edges and sky. Still caught between its creases. As for the river corridor, they added a plaque on the wall near the mural. It didn't mention presidents or motorcades or rain chased by disciplined courage. It said, sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points is a kindness. If you stood in just the right place, you could see your reflection in the plastic cover. Of the plaque, your face superimposed over painted wheat. If you listened closely, you could hear footfalls, a soft thump, a smoother step. Not less. Different. Stronger. And if you happened to be on a commercial flight passing over Kansas at 28,000 feet on a day, when the light was good, you might look out and see a hospital that looked like a matchbox and wonder, for no reason you could name, why your chest felt larger than your shirt. It might be the air. Or it might be that somewhere down there, a promise had been kept in a way it had not first been imagined, and the world, briefly, had shifted a degree toward mercy, which is, more often than not, all the Detour ever asks.